Well, welcome everybody to another meeting of the Russia Policy Forum. My name is Ian Kelly. I am Ambassador in Residence in the Program of International Studies and in the Department of Slavic Languages. We are very fortunate to have the Consul General of Germany as our guest today. We would be happy to have Herr Moessinger really at any time, but we're particularly interested in hearing from Herr Moessinger, and given the events of the last month or so, and of course Germany has been at the center of some of the efforts to try and deal with this crisis. The Chancellor was in Washington last week, in Moscow this week. He's speaking to the President today, later on. I think you've gotten Herr Moessinger's bio, but I think if you look at his latest assignments, you can see why we're so interested in hearing his point of view. He has served in Eurasia, in Moscow, Baku, but I think most appropriately he was Consul General in Dnipro, which of course covers eastern Ukraine. So Herr Moessinger, if you're ready, we would like to hear your remarks, and then I hope we'll have a good discussion. So thank you again for being with us today.
Yes, hello everybody, and thank you Ian and Ben for inviting me to speak to your students and to this exquisite audience in a very difficult time, in a time of tension, in which we are all actually looking up every morning when we get up in the news program whether or not something has happened last night, something that we don't want to happen. Let me just summarize in 4 or 5 points what the German position is in this Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is already a misnomer in that sense that there was no conflict until Russia made up a conflict. So first of all, and I think this is very important for the American public to understand, that Germany is united with all its Western partners, especially with the United States and the European partners, in elaborating and hammering out a package of sanctions against Russia in case Russia invades Ukraine, and that we are all united in this, and that the package of sanctions will be a united one and will be a severe one, and will be one that is basically geared to harm Russia's ability to compete in the world markets on certain aspects, and as far as we can influence that in developing their defense and other capabilities that can harm us. So that will be a very severe package of sanctions, far beyond of what we know with this existing sanctions that are in place since 2014. On the other hand, and that is equally important, is that we are on the forefront of all the offers of all the Western community to negotiate with Russia on what are their real grievances, and if there is a possibility to alleviate these grievances in negotiations. And that means we have to have a dialogue on the European security architecture that would also give Russia the assurance that they need without giving up our principles and our values. This can be very tricky because at the moment, at least in the public statements, what Russia wants us to do is to exclude forever in the future Ukrainian NATO membership, and that is against our principles to kind of decide the fate of the foreign policy of a country against the will of this country, or even without asking the will of this country. And President Zelensky has stated a couple of days ago that it's still a dream for Ukraine to become member of NATO and the European Union. He didn't say when the dream is going to be true, but he said at least this is still the aspiration of the country. And this is not in our principles to let this country down because of these principles. The third point is that Germany has been and still is the biggest single donor to Ukraine when it comes to economic support, when it comes to support Ukraine's sovereignty and democratic development. And that I can bear witness to that personally, because in the 4 years in which I spent in Dnipro from 2015 to 2019, I mainly spent my time with either humanitarian efforts to alleviate the life for those people who live along the contact line, and to support Ukrainian civil society organizations in developing a Western-style democracy. So we can talk about this later if you're interested in more detail, but I think this is important to understand that Germany has been, since the Donbas crisis, the single biggest donor, and of course within the European Union also the donor who contributes 20% of that budget on top. The fourth issue is that in the United States there is a conception that Germany is dependent on Russian gas in a way that would influence our decision making. Yes, we are dependent on Russian gas to an extent that would harm us if this gas would not come anymore. Let's give some figures. The gas supply in the German energy mix is about 20%. And of that gas supply, about half is coming from Russia. So our overall energy demand is covered by 10% of gas from Russia. So 10% is not nothing. To substitute these 10%, that will be a challenge and will be difficult, but it's not impossible on the world markets nowadays. Now look at the other way. 2/3 of the budget of the Russian Federation government, the federal government, depends on the revenues of oil and gas exports. So at least you could say there is an interdependency between Russia and Germany in that field. And I leave it up to you to think what could be replaced, what could be substituted more easily for us, Russian gas by buying gas elsewhere, or our money for the Russians by selling gas somewhere else. And where would be the else be? Just remind you that there is no pipeline from Russian gas fields towards China. So there is no immediate replacement as a customer if Russia wants to punish us as well as a reaction to our sanctions. So the fifth point I would like to make is looking into what Russia actually wants to achieve. And I think there are three purposes. The first, and I think the main purpose for Russia, is to keep Ukraine unstable. A successful Western-style democratic country, Ukraine, would be a threat to the governance style of Russia, would be a threat to Putin's own power. So he cannot allow that Ukraine becomes a successful democracy. And that has been the case from the very beginning, since Ukraine has chosen to follow the path towards a Western democracy, that the Russians have tried to make this country be, how to say, unattractive for foreign investment by keeping it always under a certain threat. And if you look at how strongly President Zelensky tries to kind of keep business as normal going, that is, I mean, in my view, very evident that he wants to continue to portray Ukraine as a reliable country in which foreign investors are welcome and in which they are safe. So this is something that Russia has tried from the very beginning, since Ukraine has chosen this path. And unfortunately, I think in this case, Russia has succeeded because, as you can see, the Ukrainian currency had faltered and the Ukrainian economy has not really advanced very well in the last 5 to 10 years. The second purpose of his aggression is simply to put Russia back on the picture of the big powers. If you think in the last couple of years, we have all been speaking about the American-Chinese dichotomy, the kind of the struggle of who is going to lead the world, China or America. And Russia did not appear in this equation. And I think that is something that Mr. Putin is not very happy about it. And that's why he puts his country back on the map of the big powers. And I think with this aggression, we are now only talking about Russia. It might please Mr. Xi, but in basic, here Putin has also succeeded in that purpose. And the third purpose is that, and this is an old Russian kind of strategy, to drive a wedge between the Western allies, to drive a wedge between Europe and America, and to drive a wedge between European states by favoring some, by punishing others, by disinformation, and especially also by economic favors or disfavors. So I think this is the last purpose that he hasn't succeeded. On the opposite, he has failed because the Western alliance is now stronger than before, and we are more united in our positions towards Russia than ever before. And that's the same type of failure that Mr. Putin had when he kind of possibly thought that attacking Ukraine would make Ukraine crumble, because in his view, Ukraine is a weak state, is a state that is not self-confident, and where he would simply kind of, that would fall in his hand if he dismantles the Ukrainian statehood and the Ukrainian sovereignty. And even there he has failed, because when I was in the Ukraine, people, whether they are speaking Russian or whether they were speaking Ukrainian, was not a big difference in their political opinion. When I asked them what is the Ukrainian identity, there was very different opinions, but there was always one thing that all these people mentioned, and that was, we are not Russians. And I think that is another miscalculation, misconception of Mr. Putin, because he always underestimates the strength of democracies, because that democracies empower the people to follow their dreams. And that is what is the strength of our democracies. And that brings me to the next point. What can we do other than stay united and be prepared? And I think a very important point is to keep our democracies safe and thriving. When I was in Ukraine, people were always mentioning, we're always interested in how does democracy work, whether it was the German one, the American one, or whatever other country it was. And if we allow our democracies to kind of deteriorate in tribal warfare among ourselves, in the doubts of our institutions, in the doubts of our democratic system, I think that would be very, very demoralizing for these people in Ukraine and in other countries in the Eastern Europe, because they would be deprived of a model. They would be deprived of a goal where they want to aspire to, what they want to reach. So I think it's very important also to see our internal fights to safeguard democracy also as what it radiates abroad. I mean, it is always difficult. I remember the time in 2020, November, December 2020, when we were all trying to convince Mr. Lukashenko to accept that he lost his election. When they then said, why should Mr. Lukashenko accept that when the American president doesn't accept his defeat? So this is a very important point, which is a link between the two issues, which is not very often put together. So this two-pronged approach of preparing sanctions and preparing tough reaction to what Russia may do on the one hand and negotiating on the other hand is for us Europeans, of course, maybe even more urgent than for America. Because it's clear that economic sanctions against Russia, as the President Biden yesterday said, they will be felt in our countries as well. There will be some repercussions on our economy as well. And of course, on our economy in Germany, much more than on the economy in the United States. But that would not hinder us to participate in whatever sanctions we can agree together. Look, when I was in Eastern Ukraine, for me, traveling to the contact line, and that I did about a dozen times, reminded me on the border between East and West Germany 30 years, 40 years ago. And this border, the Berlin Wall, which was the symbol of the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, that symbol is now the contact line in Eastern Ukraine between democracy and authoritarianism. And if we allow authoritarianism to regain our realm, then I think we will have it very difficult to stop it again. Sorry. And for that reason, I think we really have to stand firm now. And I really think that we have to stand firm together. And from that point, I would leave it for that at the moment and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. That was a very useful review of the situation that we're in and the stakes that are involved. And I particularly appreciated the way you laid out the main goals of Russia, and I just couldn't agree with you more on those main goals. So we are going to move to the discussion part of our program today. We have about 40 minutes to have a discussion. Please use the raise hand function under reactions at the bottom of your screen. I am going to take the privilege of asking the first question, though, if you all don't mind. Yesterday, Chancellor Scholz called on Putin to send his negotiators to Europe to work out a diplomatic solution to this crisis. So my question is, what do you think the chances are of a diplomatic solution? And if you think that there is a chance for it, what do you think such a solution would look like?
We all hope that there is a diplomatic solution, but as I said in the beginning, a diplomatic solution when Russia demands from us to give up our principles is, of course, very difficult to see at the moment. And I think some remarks of Chancellor Scholz yesterday in Moscow were very were pointing towards a possible solution by saying NATO membership of Ukraine is not something that is on the agenda now. And he made a joke that he doesn't know how long Putin will stay in power, but he still doesn't think that even in the time of these two leaders are in power, this will be a question that will be on the agenda. But of course, that doesn't mean that we could exclude this possibility forever. And I think there is between these two statements, there is room for maneuver. But it must come from Kiev. And we are certainly not going to pressurize Kiev to state that, okay, we won't seek NATO membership for the next whatever 10, 20 or whatever years. Although I think that's about the time frame that is realistic, even without taking away, without considering outside pressure, because that's the time that Ukraine probably needs to develop into a state that could become a member state of NATO or of the European Union. But of course, if we had a deadline for that, or if we had a goal for that, we could start many other more concrete steps towards achieving this goal. But a part of that, I think this is where the possibilities are, and what other possibilities to make Russia feel more secure. On the other hand, we have the NATO-Russia Council since 1997, in which we actually promised, really in writing, that certain weapon systems will not be moved to the eastern member states of NATO. Yes, NATO has expanded, but certain weapon systems have not been moved east. And we stuck to the NATO-Russia Council agreements. Russia did not. Neither did Russia stick to the Budapest Memorandum, promising Ukraine to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty, and receiving in turn the nuclear arsenal that was located on Ukrainian territory after the split of the Soviet Union. So the Russian claims that we have broken our promises, while Russia has always stuck very, very meticulously to theirs, is of course a myth. As much in this propaganda war is a myth. But we have to be also very self-confident in saying that we kept our promises, and now we expect you to keep yours as well. In the framework of the NATO-Russia Council and other international agreements, we can see whether we can make some commitments even stronger, that we don't pursue any aggressive act against Russia, which in fact we don't. I don't think anybody is here suspecting the West to attack Russia in any way. But you always have to put yourself into the position of the other side. And if the Russians feel this approach of NATO coming closer to the Russian borders is a threat, then we have to see what can we do to alleviate this fear without giving up our principles, as I said. And the NATO-Russia Council and other international bodies like the OSCE give enough room to find solutions to make Russia more happy. But there are two basic things that we cannot change, that only Russia can change, and that is to ask us to give up our principles and speak for other countries. I mean, for example, the NATO extension towards Poland. Imagine when Poland wanted to become a NATO member state, Russians and Germans tell the Poles what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do. We had that in history for many centuries, and I think we couldn't have that anymore. And the second point I want to make is, one has to ask the question, why do these countries like Poland, Baltic states, and now maybe Ukraine want to be under the protection of NATO? And the answer is simple: because they fear Russia. And as long as Russia behaves in a way that this fear is actually justified, the Russians can threaten whatever they like. These countries will try to get under the protection of NATO as soon as they can. So if Russia wants to stop the Western alliance of getting ever closer to their country, they have to behave in a way that these countries do not fear them anymore. And that is a change of behavior that can only come out of Moscow, that we can't do it, but we should probably sometimes say it a little bit more and a little bit louder, that the whole aspirations of these countries to become NATO member states has to do with the behavior of Russia.
Yes, that's a very good point. This idea that what is happening really is a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more coercive they become, the more threatening they become, the more united NATO is, and the more, of course, the frontline states want to join NATO. So yes, thank you for that. So we have a couple of raised hands. We'll go to them first, and then I see some people in the chat. So we'll start first with my Northwestern colleague, Olga Kamenchuk. Go ahead, Olga.
Thank you. Yes, I muted myself. Thank you, Ambassador, for a very interesting presentation, very good to the point. I have a comment and a couple of questions. So first of all, the comment. Yes, Ukraine is not Russia, and we researchers know how important this statement and position for Ukrainians is. We have conducted studies in Ukraine proper and in the Donbas region of Ukraine, and have seen quite some differences in perception of population in both areas, but largely they are connected with focus towards international organizations such as EU or Eurasian Union or NATO, and versus international players. So that's where often the divide we see. Regarding my question, so first, how much Russian actions in Crimea and Donbas, from your perspective, prevent Ukraine from being able to join NATO? I mean, the contested borders and all that topic. My second question is regarding Mr. Biden's words, President Biden's words, that if Putin invades Ukraine again, the Nord Stream is over. How likely is that, especially given that you emphasize that 10% of Germany's energy needs are coming from Russian gas? And finally, are there chances that Germany will up its military supplies to Ukraine? I mean, besides offering 500 helmets. Thank you.
I mean, to be honest, NATO has scored a certain own goal when they decided that states with border conflicts cannot join NATO. And that is, of course, an invitation to any power to create such a border conflict. And that is what at the moment is already formal. I mean, we don't talk about policies and all that, but simply a formal reason why Ukraine cannot join NATO. Of course, that's a decision that NATO can reverse if they want to. But I would say that at the moment, to really start processes to allow Ukraine to become a NATO member would probably be really dangerous. On the other hand, nobody precludes us from supporting Ukrainian military, but also the Ukrainian state to become more compatible with Western structures in many respects. And coming to the third question of yours, military support. It is probably, it's not a fair assessment to say that our military support to Ukraine consists of 500 helmets and that's it. Ask the families of the couple of dozen Ukrainian soldiers who got their treatment in German military hospitals after they have been wounded at the front line. Ask the military hospital staff in Kiev and in Dnipro who've gotten German support. And we have just now sent a completely new mobile military hospital to Ukraine. And ask all these Ukrainian officers who have been trained in Germany by German soldiers exactly to become compatible to NATO. Yes, we do not deliver lethal weapons, but it is not fair to say that we have not supported the Ukrainian military in many, many other ways, including especially to make it more NATO compatible, also in the way that Ukrainian soldiers are actually treated in the army, because there is still very much old Soviet style treatment of soldiers. Your second question to the gas, there was a bit of a technical problem in between. I didn't understand the whole question. But as far as I understand, Nord Stream 2 has the processes to certify Nord Stream 2 is on hold at the moment for bureaucratic reasons. But as you know, bureaucrats can prolong these reasons as long as they like. So the point is we can reinvigorate this process, and we can certify the pipeline in a couple of months, maybe at the earliest, if Gazprom is following European rules. But we can also stop it forever. And I think if you have followed the press conference of President Biden and Chancellor Scholz, it is pretty clear. President Biden said, if Ukraine invades, Nord Stream 2 is dead. And the Chancellor said, I have nothing to add to this statement. I mean, what else would you like to hear?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that perspective too on the, putting the German role in supporting Ukraine in a broader context. Next, I'd like to ask my colleague, Jordan Gans-Morse, to ask a question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Consul General. I'm Jordan Gans-Morse from the Department of Political Science and the faculty director for the Russian, Eurasian, East European Studies program, and really appreciated and enjoyed your talk. I wanted just to get your impression in a little more detail about something you mentioned in terms of Putin misestimating and misunderstanding Ukrainian identity today. And I know from your biography that you've served all over the former Soviet Union, not just in Ukraine. I'm not sure to what extent you've had recent contact with Russian diplomats yourself or connections and friends in Russia, but do you have a sense, I mean, we obviously don't know what's in Putin's head, but among Russian foreign policy experts, ideally those maybe who have some influence on Putin, but even more broadly, do you have a sense that they understand the shift that has occurred in Ukraine in the last, say at least 6 years since 2014, but particularly even these last couple of months? Because my impression is that Russians relate Ukraine, as I've sometimes said in conversations with my colleagues at Northwestern, kind of like Americans relate to Canadians, and kind of have an assumption that we understand everything because we are similar, and don't, for that reason, really have real experts and people who really learn about it. So I'm curious about your opinion. Do the Russians realize that that things are very, very different than they used to be?
Yeah, there is no Russian consulate general in Chicago, so I don't have any immediate contact to Russian colleagues at the moment. When I was in Ukraine, which is now 3 years ago, there were some Russians among the OSCE observers, which was always controversial for the Ukrainian government and among other observers. But I took the opportunity to speak to these Russian observers as well, and some of them really opened up. And they said already these 3 years ago that the people in Moscow do not really understand the shift in Ukraine. They still think that Ukraine shouldn't exist because it's not a real country, it's not a real people, it's not a real subject of international law. And they have not noticed that this has changed. The interesting thing is that, of course, you have a lot of Ukrainian media outlets that are fueled by Russian propaganda and run by oligarchs that are pro-Russian. And that is that's probably what reflects then back on Moscow, because that, how to say, this audience who watches these TV channels, if they reply, if they engage, then of course they are engaging exactly in the sense that that the Russians expected. I mean, put it in American perspective, you have also these media bubbles of the one side or the other side. And if you only talk to these people within this bubble, you of course get the opinion that you are in the overwhelming majority and the others are some outliers. And I think there is a little bit of that in Russia. On the other hand, of course, the Russians have so many sources inside Ukraine that they actually should know otherwise. How much of that gets up the hierarchy on the top level, it's anybody's guess. But I think, and that is something that has opened my eyes when I read this book of Timothy Snyder about Russia a couple of years ago. If you think that Putin is of the firm opinion that Western-style democracy is nothing for his country, is something that his country should not have, should never have, must never have. And if you think in his view, Ukraine is kind of like Russia, then he simply doesn't understand why the Ukrainian people now suddenly wants to become democratic, Western-style country. And that is, I think, really deep in his mind. That's something that he doesn't accept as a fact. And he thinks everything that the Ukrainians do in that respect is induced by Americans' pressure, propaganda, money, corruption. And of course, it's not wrong to say that you can manipulate Ukrainian politicians and politics by money. I think that would be naive to deny that. But you cannot create this overall feeling by 70% maybe of Ukrainians who want to become a democracy, that is fueled only and entirely by some kind of propaganda and corruption from America. This is simply the dream of these people. And then another point that I think we should stress more, before the pandemic, even the young Russians in Russia, they voted with their feet because they emigrated to the West. We have had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Russians who chose to go to the West for studying, for working, for living, because that's where they saw their dream could be fulfilled and not at home. And now let's look who went the other way. How many people from Western countries emigrated to Russia because Russia is the better place to live? I know two, and they have specific reasons, and these are Edward Snowden and Gérard Depardieu. I don't know of any two others who did this. And I think we should mention that sometimes in the public as well, that it's not the Russian people doesn't even share the propaganda tool, the propaganda slogans of the Russians, that the West is in decline and Russia is a stable, successful country, because the young people see it otherwise.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Wolfgang. And speaking of propaganda, my colleague, Professor McReynolds, has to go to another meeting, but she's made a comment in the chat. She'd like you to comment on the danger of falling into a propaganda trap by uncritically repeating Putin's claims that they're under threat, that they need lock solid assurances. I mean, isn't this? Don't we fall into the danger of perpetuating this myth? Everybody knows that there's zero chance that the U.S. or NATO is going to attack Russia. If you could comment on that.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Nobody has any intention of that kind, but I think it's still fair to try to put yourself into the view of Russians, and not necessarily of government, but ordinary Russians. Of course, they have been manipulated by their own propaganda to a certain view on the West. But even if people are kind of still independently minded to peel away this propaganda from what they see as the world as it is now, of course they see the West is coming ever closer to Russia. Of course they see that countries that were under the influence of Moscow in the Soviet Union and in the Warsaw Pact and so on have now joined the alliance that has been created to stand up against the Soviet Union at the time. So it is I think for diplomatic purposes, of course, absolutely necessary to take this perception into account and then to find where are the ways and means to alleviate this, and to give the Russians at least the assurance in a more obvious way that we don't have this attention. And the NATO-Russia Council was this attempt in the 1990s, and it worked fine for a while. Yeltsin was happy with it. It took a while before Putin became unhappy with it, because he used it the first years in his power as well as a tool of negotiating and of working with us. That is now just coming back to the issue, why does he do it now what he's doing? And there are lots of theories which I can't go into it because I'm not close enough to see any internal wheelings and dealings in the Russian nomenclatura, why there was obviously some kind of pressure, or whether it was simply an opportunist movement in Moscow thinking the West is weak at the moment, so let's try it. So maybe it's not a satisfying answer, but that's all what I can say to what we can do to fight propaganda. We just say what the reality is.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think Susan just put in the chat that, of course, there's a contradiction between a feeling that the Russians fear the West and of course the desire to go to the West. I don't know if we can actually square that circle or
sorry,
reconcile
but
that.
for example, we have a couple of million of Russian Germans who came to Germany after the opening up of the Soviet Union because they were ethnic Germans. Many of them have enjoyed in Germany a decent life, got jobs, maybe not at the level they had jobs in Russia, because some of them were really academics and people in higher levels, but still they are better off in Germany now than they were at the time in the Soviet Union. And many of them are so nostalgic still that they actually think that Putin is a great leader. So this contradiction of what is actually really the fact and your own advantages and what you think personally, politically, this discrepancy is sometimes striking and for me not always explainable, but it's there even among those Russian Germans who came to Germany in the 1990s because they saw that that's where their future is and that's where they have aspirations. They couldn't always fulfill them 100%, but nobody is going back to Russia because they know they're still better off in Germany as an ordinary employee than they would be in Russia as a professor.
Yeah.
So that's a strange thing, but that's how it is.
Yeah, yeah. Like I say, it's a contradiction, really, or
Yeah.
cognitive dissonance. I don't know how you want to call it, but
Yeah.
so we have about 10 minutes left, and we have a couple more questions and comments in the chat.
Try to be brief.
Neonila, or do you want to ask yourself, or you want me to read the question? You can unmute yourself. Just please read. Okay. So both of them have questions about Nord Stream 2. So Neonila is asking about this idea in Germany that that economic issues like constructing Nord Stream 2 should be held separate from politics, that they should not become a matter of bargaining in politics. She asks, is this a generally held position in Germany regarding all countries, or is it a Russia-related exceptionalism? And then she adds a comment that the real concern here of Russia is the economic expansion of the European Union into the Eurasian space, like Ukraine, and that is a real threat. And what is your opinion on that?
it's a very strange thing. When Germany started to have pipelines built from Russia, it was still in the Soviet time. And at that time, it was seen as something positive, kind of to bridge the gap, to bridge the divide between East and West by doing business with each other. Of course, that was a political point at the time. It was, of course, also commercial because that gas was relatively cheap and reliable, but it was also political. So when then in the late 2000s and around 2010s, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was conceived. It was still seen as a predominantly economic project with positive political repercussions, kind of keeping the Russians nearby and having to deal with them. And I think it was always Angela Merkel who kept this up, and of course Gerhard Schröder, who, if you take an ex-chancellor as your chairman, then it can't be really unpolitical. So it has always been to a certain extent political. And we have now one party in the government, the Green Party, who was opposed to this project from the very beginning, first for ecological and then later for political reasons. Yes, I think it was a mistake to treat this project as purely commercial. And I think nobody in Germany is still seriously thinking that we should keep it purely on a commercial level. And even if this current crisis will go away, and even if the Nord Stream 2 will come into operation, I still think it will always be one piece of our leverage towards Russia to close it down again. And of course, our job in Germany is now to find alternative sources for the energy so that we are not cannot be bribed into all kinds of concessions, which we are really not, to be clear. And the other question is, Russia fears more the economic hold. I'm not so sure, because on the other hand, Russia has benefited also from the economic extension of the EU, because by keeping some of their old economic relations to countries like Bulgaria or like Hungary, they have now a foothold within the EU. So I think from a purely commercial point of view, the EU is not something that threatens Russia, but it even enhances Russia's possibilities to do business with Europe. But as everything in Russia, economic and business relations are overseen by political decisions. I mean, you know exactly that Mr. Putin would not give up his political strategic goals just because it would cost his country and his people a certain level of their lifestyle. So that has political strategies are always more important than economic ones in Russia.
Okay, thank you for that. We have two more questions. I suspect that's all we'll have time for. I'll read the first, and then I'll ask Elzbieta to unmute herself. But let me read Rashad bin Haroun's question. If Nord Stream 2 doesn't move forward, how do you think that would, what sort of knock-on effects would that have in terms of supply chain and other disruptions around the world, given that Germany is such an economic powerhouse?
Shall I answer, or shall I wait for the second question?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Why don't we, Elzbieta, why don't you ask your question and you can take them both?
Yeah, my question is more political, and I was wondering if you mentioned that, as we know, Russia usually is more interested in political motives rather than economic ones. I was wondering, though, if and I thought your analysis of Putin's opportunistic kind of tactics is very good. But I was wondering if there was also one element might not be his trying to mask the or neutralize the mass protests and that we saw in Russia and Navalny's influence, which of course now is attenuated because Navalny is in prison, and so creating this possibility of war and creating this external threat as a way to neutralize opposition within Russia itself.
Yes. I'll take the second question first. I agree. Certainly, there is some element of this diversion of putting the attention to other things because the economic situation for many Russians isn't good. Not even taking political unrest, simply the economic situation in the country is not really good. So he can shift the attention to some external threat. We have had that in history hundreds of times. Many leaders did that. Look at Turkey, for example, at the moment as well. But this is normal. But on the other hand, Putin has to fear also something else, and that is that if he really goes to war in Ukraine, what will happen if the first soldiers come back in their coffins? I think the worst thing that happened in his time as president was the protest of the soldiers' mothers after the first Ukraine invasion, when they asked publicly on the Red Square, what happened to our sons? And he had to do something that is very unpopular in Russia. He had to send the police to arrest the mothers of soldiers. I don't think this is something that he wants to see again. And I think that is something that is very much in his mind as well. So I always think this is a very big element of his thinking, because that was highly embarrassing for him at the time. Nord Stream 2. I mean, if Nord Stream 2 is not operational at the moment, so we do not benefit from the gas we get through this pipeline. So if we don't get it, we just have to continue to live without it, which means we would have to continue looking for diversification, but also for reducing our demand of gas. And that is actually something that's going to happen anyway. By 2030, 2040, gas will be much less important in Germany than it is now, hopefully in the whole of Europe. So from that point of view, Nord Stream 2 not getting operational is at the moment not really threatening any supply chains or any economic activities at the moment in the country. The other option is, or the other issue is, of course, much more worrying, is if we have sanctions to Russia and Russia then kind of tries to punish us by stopping the deliveries they are contractually due at the moment, like Nord Stream 1 or the pipelines through Ukraine. That would give us a real big headache how to substitute that. But it should give the Russians an even bigger headache on how to substitute the income from the revenue from these exports. So I don't think this is going to happen, but you cannot exclude it, and you have to have contingency plans in that case. And I think our leaders are having contingency plans in that respect. But what the German main direction of policies is now with our new energy policy is to get away from fossil fuels anyway, and in that respect, to become more independent or less dependent. It's of course a longer term project for 20, 30 years, but we have already shown in the last 10 years that we can reduce our fossil fuel demand considerably. So that I think we are on the right path for that as well.
Yes, it's interesting. One of the unintended consequences of the Russian invasion of Georgia was the decision of the Georgian government to stop importing Russian gas and moved entirely to Azerbaijani and Central Asian gas. And of course, Georgia is a small market, didn't really affect Russia, but the loss of Europe would be devastating in terms of losing that market. So, Wolfgang, I really, I'm no longer a diplomat. I'm a teacher now, and that was a solid A+. That presentation. If you ever feel like becoming an adjunct professor of international studies, please contact me, Jordan Gans-Morse or Benjamin, Cindy, because that was a tour de force. Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating in this fascinating discussion. So
thank you.
Thank you.
And I might take you up on this offer.